morning as we are continuing our series on habits. Thankful for Life Church. What a cool video. That's a great video. But it really does show the difference that small actions done repeatedly over time lead to big consequences. And that can be good or that can be bad. You know, the truth is when we're talking about habits, we're talking about good habits and bad habits. And we probably all experienced this at some point in some way or another, where we've done small things consistently good. Maybe someone gathered you as a young adult and they said, look, if you'll just save 10% of your income and you'll put it in the bank, and I promise you, it seems like retirement is really long way away, but it will begin to build over time. And you listened to that advice and you did small things and it didn't seem like much. And it didn't seem like it was ever going to make a big difference. But now you're seeing the return. It's become a big difference in your life. You've probably also experienced it negatively, right? That you it was just a bag of chips. But the problem was it was a bag of chips like day after day after day after day after day. And pretty soon the doctor says, look, we've got to talk about this blood work. And you're like, what do you mean? I really didn't, it's not that big of a deal. But as we look back, these small decisions done daily, they lead to big consequences, whether good or bad. And so we've been diving into this topic of habits. And the last 2 weeks, we really spent time on this idea of who we are in Jesus Christ, of what we are called in the Bible, that we are sons and daughters of God. Why? Because identity really does result in our action. That as we have an identity in Christ, it changes the actions that we take part in. At least it should. And the truth is, when it doesn't change our actions, we have to ask ourselves, do we really believe that is our identity? If you're a diehard Alabama or Auburn fan, you don't typically wear the other team's colors. I don't care what it's for, right? I mean, like if you begin to look at your wardrobe and all of a sudden you see crimson and white and it has nothing to do with Alabama, but you're just like, no, that's not me. I'm not going to wear that. I don't want anyone to be confused. Or blue and, orange, right? If you're just like, I understand that's a great color scheme, but that's not for me. It will never be in my wardrobe, right? I mean, why? Because you identify. And it changes your actions. And that's an easy example, especially in our culture right here. But it's something that we begin to realize that when we truly do have an identity, it does change our actions. And when it doesn't change our actions, we have to ask ourselves, is that truly the way in which we see ourselves? Sometimes I think that the enemy can do a number on us. The Bible describes him as a liar, as a thief, as one when he lies, it's in his native tongue. What an amazing description, right, of who Satan truly is. That when he speaks, he's speaking lies. And one of the greatest lies, I believe, that he speaks into that of a believer as we're having the spiritual battle in which we find ourselves in is that is not your identity. I mean, everyone else may think that's your identity. You may have even claimed that that's your identity, but you and I know the truth. You're not a child of God. No. You are a sinner, and you have no hope of ever changing. And when we begin to identify with that identity, it's amazing how it begins to affect our actions. Maybe not in public, but in those small, still moments in our life. Those things done daily, time after time after time after time again. Well, the truth is this, studies by neurobiologists and cognitive psychologists, because you know me, that's who I always read, right? But studies by those individuals state this, that they indicate that from 40 to 95% of human behavior falls into the habit category. That astounded me, that from 40 to 95% of when we wake up and what we do during the day, study has found that it really, you could group it into a habit, right? And I was thinking about this week because, you kind of know what you're preaching on, you kind of want to make sure it's truth, right? And so I watched myself and I thought, how much of my time is really habitual? And I thought, definitely the morning. When I wake up, I have a routine. There's certain places I go in the morning, and I'll turn off certain lights, and I let out the dog, and I feed the dog while he's out, and then I put the food in his room, and I let him in, then I lock him up because I don't want to deal with him. It's too early. And then I go to the coffee, and I make my coffee, and then I go for my breakfast. And I mean, it's all habitual, right? I'm not thinking. Like, what do I want to drink this morning? No, I'm not thinking that, of course, I'm drinking coffee. I mean, that's going to be what I drink. It's not a thought process. It's just a habit. I'm not thinking, where am I going in the house today? No. There's a habitual element to my life. I found that the way in which I deal with conflict, and this one's hard, but the way in which I deal with conflict, it's almost a habit. Like I have certain things that I do and certain things that I naturally begin to gravitate towards. And I'll find myself, I'll catch them in myself. And it's just the ways that I respond. The ways that I respond in my downtime. If you sit down on the couch and you pull out your phone and all of a sudden and it's like you didn't make a conscious decision. You know what? Today from 3 to 4, I'm going to surf Facebook. No, you just sat down and all of a sudden you were there and you're going through it, right? And it's one of the reasons why I told you a couple of weeks ago I deleted it off my phone because it was becoming much too much of a habit. And I found myself just wrapped up in this habitual thing that whenever I was sitting down, I was pulling out my phone. Whenever I was sitting down, I was pulling out my phone. It was just become a habit. And I was pulling it out. It's like I couldn't sit down without having my phone there. I thought, this is not good. This is not a habit that I want to find myself into. I'll stop stepping on toes. All right, we're going to move on, though. And we're going to realize that a lot of what we do is habit-based. And so, we change our habits. We really do begin to change the life in which we live. You say, well, that sounds very secular. That doesn't really sound spiritual, right? I mean, that doesn't sound like that Christ is our transformation. And I want us to understand that it begins and ends, and it is Jesus Christ within our life. But there's things that he calls us to do as believers in Jesus Christ, and that he modeled for us as disciples of his, that if we will begin to live that life as a model after Jesus, it's amazing how our life will begin to look more like that of the Savior's. And as a disciple, that should be what we truly desire to do. I mean, if you study discipleship in the midst of Jewish cultures at the beginning of the time of Jesus, that we find that the ultimate goal of the disciple was to become like the teacher. In fact, most scholars say that there was this saying among disciples at the time, specifically during the time period of Jesus, is that they wanted to be covered in the dust of their rabbi. I love that phrase. And what does that mean? It means that they wanted to follow their teacher so closely that as he walked, the dust of the rabbi, the dust of the teacher, would just be covering them. Why? Because they were so close to him. They were following his every move. It wasn't something that they saw from far off. No. They were always present with their teacher. And so we have to ask ourselves, if that is true, and I love the way that our pastor says it at Life Church, much of what you normally do isn't a result of conscious choices, but a result of daily habits. I think that really brings it in a concise manner, that much of what you normally do isn't the result of conscious choices, but a result of daily habits. If that is true, then how do we begin to change those habits? Well, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at Daniel in the Old Testament, and we touched briefly on him because he really is this model of a habit in which we should follow. And I wanted to come back there as we look at Daniel chapter 6 and begin to look at the life in which Daniel lived and how that life came about. Because again, whenever I've talked with people, I've never talked with someone and said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then their answer was a loser, right? Or I just want to be a sinner. I just want to have a terrible relationship. I want to have my kids hate me. No one ever, that's never the goal, right? But how do you get to where you feel like, this is where I desire to be in Jesus Christ. This is where I desire my life to go. This is really, if I could look at my life, I would say that my life is honoring to God as a disciple in Jesus Christ. How do we get there? Well, Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, it shows the reputation of Daniel. It says in verse 3, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So because of Daniel's life, and the phrase that's mentioned there is his exceptional qualities, the plan was to set him in charge of everything. The exceptional qualities. Right? When the king looked out over all of the young men throughout the kingdom, Daniel was the one that naturally rose to the top. Now, what was special about Daniel? What was it about him that really, when you looked at Daniel, you just thought, no, that kid's going someplace, right? Like that's the one I want in charge. And how do we get that into our life? How are we able to have exceptional qualities? Has anyone ever looked at you and said, exceptional qualities, right? I mean, it's something that we desire, but how do we get that in our life? Well, when we continue to read through chapter 6, what we find is that there's this, it's not just an appearance, because can we just say that sometimes it's easy to fool people. Right? I mean, and you grew up in school, and when you went to school, there was probably someone in your class that the teacher thought they were one way, but you knew they were somewhere else, right? Or maybe it was like your friends, and the parents all thought the kid was a really good kid, but you knew that was the rottenest kid. I mean, they just knew how to play the crowd, right? They knew when to turn it on and when to turn it off. They knew how to play the adults. They knew how to do these type of things. And so it would be easy when you look at someone like Daniel to say, well, is that just a show? Is it just something that he had learned to do as one who could turn it on? When the king came, all of a sudden he was working. You ever worked? I remember Elijah and I were talking about our work experience. My work experience. He doesn't have much, right? But we were talking about my work experience as a young man and through college, and I was telling him all the places I worked in college, and I told him, there was a place called the Big Giant Warehouse, and it was a unique name because it really was a big giant warehouse, right? And that was the name, and it was a grocery store and then a warehouse on one side. But we had people who, they would look the part as soon as the boss came. Right, so like if it was stocking shelves or whatever it was, man, when the boss rounded the corner, they were busy, they were working, but as soon as the boss left, or if they knew the boss had taken a break, all of a sudden it was like they were just a completely different person. It just irritated you because you're like, no, that's not who they are. But eventually it would seem they would get found out because you can't fool people forever. And so those who are around Daniel, they set out to see what's really behind the exceptional qualities, right? They began to get jealous of him and thought, no one is this good. No one is this exceptional. There's always a flaw. There's always a crack. We just got to look hard enough. And so it says this in verse 4, at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. I mean, obviously that's true with most of our political leaders. But for Daniel, this was very rare in Daniel's case, right? That they looked for it. They tried to find the corruption. They tried to find the negligence, and they couldn't find any. And it shows that this wasn't just a facade that Daniel put on in front of the king, that this was it was about the way in which he lived his life. And I thought, how amazing would it be if as believers in Jesus Christ, no matter what element we were placed in, whether it was our job place or whether it was our school environment or whether it was just in the community, that exceptional qualities would rise to the top. And that when people would begin to look for the cracks, when they would begin to try and find where these flaws were, and if this was just a show, that they would find that there was no corruption, that he truly was trustworthy, neither corrupt nor negligent in his actions. What an amazing testimony that Daniel had. Man, how do you get that? Right? How do you become that person? I mean, how is it that when you're dealing with kind of climbing the corporate ladder and when you're kind of going through these things that there isn't times where you're just kind of weak and you take the easy way, right? You kind of just it's not really cheating. It's just kind of an infringement on the rules, or it's not really taking a bribe. It's just we're buddies and we do these type of things. How is it that you can find yourself where you're not falling victim to the traps that so many fall victim to? What's amazing is that Daniel shows us the difference. And when we read this, it sounds so elementary. I mean, it's like, seriously, that's the difference maker for Daniel? I mean, we're going to read something that seems very simple. If you grew up in church, this is going to be like, well, yeah, that's what we do. I mean, that's what we've been taught to do since we were Vacation Bible School, right? I mean, it's just something that believers should do. But we have to ask ourselves, do we do it? And has it really made the difference in our life? Because for Daniel, this was the difference maker. Verse 10, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, a decree, again, that we spoke about 2 weeks ago, that all of those who prayed to anyone, to any god or man during the next 30 days except to the king would be thrown into the lion's den. When he hears this decree, it says he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. 3 times a day he went up to his room to pray, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Now, if your life was threatened, it's amazing how much prayer becomes more part of our life. But it wasn't because Daniel's life was threatened that we find him upstairs praying 3 times a day. You know, so oftentimes in our Christian walk and in our Christian life, we can go through difficult moments, and I'm so thankful we serve a God who's there. He's willing to hear our requests, to hear our pleas. But if we're not careful, our prayers can be relegated to the times when our life is in distress. Right? As someone once said, we treat God like the spare tire, that when we're really in need, we know where He is and we can get Him. We've got access to Him. And He's going to help us out. It's not a permanent fix because we don't expect Him to do everything. But He's going to help us out and get us through this difficult situation where we're in until we can take Him off, put Him back in the trunk until we need Him once again. That's oftentimes the way in which we treat prayer life within our Christian walk. But that's not the way in which Daniel treated his prayer life. And it's not just because he was in difficulty that he was coming to the Lord in prayer. No, if you really read that, 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God. Giving thanks to God. Daniel, what are you talking about giving thanks to God? This is not a time for thank you, God. This is a time for help me, God. Right? I mean, you're in a very difficult situation. But we see that this was just such a habit in Daniel's life. This was such a part of Daniel's life that the way in which he prayed, it never really changed much. It was just this idea of, God, thank you for what you have done. God, thank you for where you have allowed me to be and for what you're doing in my life. And when we look at the life of Daniel, this had been a part of his life from the very beginning. And from an early age, he had been captured and brought to a foreign land. From an early age, he had been taught things that were contrary to what he had been taught as a kid. From an early age, he lived in a culture that was completely different than what he truly believed. And yet, from an early age, he had developed a habit to 3 times a day, kneeling on his knees, giving thanks to God, and going to the Lord in prayer. And we see this habit had begun to affect everything in his life. How tempting it would have been when you read the story of Daniel for this young man to just begin to blend into the culture in which he had found himself. You know, earlier in the beginning, if you know the story of Daniel, you'll know that when he's captured and he comes before the king, they want to give him certain food. They want to give all the young men certain food. And Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand up and they say, you know, we can't do this, and it's against our law. And they said, well, you know, we can't have you not doing it because if you're not healthy, then I'm going to get in trouble. And he kind of gives this command, just let us eat what we're allowed to eat. And if we're not healthier and you know, the best of the group by the time the time is over, then we'll do what you ask us to do. But let us prove ourselves. And sure enough, God proves faithful because of their faithfulness. See, what we see is a young man who's determined to not let the culture influence what God has called him to do in his life. And church, when I read the story of Daniel, I believe that we find ourselves in a time where a culture would love to tell us what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to be, and the way in which we're supposed to live. And we're going to be faced with a choice of, do we do it the way in which culture is speaking to us, or do we do it in the way in which God has commanded us. What's going to be the difference maker in our life? For Daniel, the difference maker was 3 times a day, getting down on his knees, praying and giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. You know, the question that comes to us is, who do you want to become? When you look at your life, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, however long God allows you to live on this earth, who do you desire to become? You know, I look at lives like Daniel, I just want to be more like that, you know? It's like, I don't want to be easily swayed by culture. I want to be one that no matter how many people are against you, there's this confidence in who you are in Jesus Christ that allows you to be who God has called you to be. And you're not fearful of the consequences because you know that God is going to go with you and you know, walk beside you. You know, Romans, the verse that Debbie read during our worship time. He has plans to prosper us, not to harm us. Plan to give us a hope and a future, right? That this idea that as we walk our life in Jesus Christ, that God is going to be there with us. I want to walk with that type of confidence. How do I get that type of confidence? Well, before I go into the how, I've got to really understand what I want to be and who I desire to be. And my prayer is that we would all, as believers in Jesus Christ, and if you're not a believer here today, that you would be challenged by the life of Daniel. That you would look at this one that even foreign leaders would look at and say, if anyone's going to be in charge, I want that young man in charge. How did he get that? It was his relationship with God. So who do you want to become? Maybe in your notes, maybe you just take a moment today or this week to really think about that question and say, who do I want to become? You know, this week we had one of those hard parenting weeks not because the kids were bad, but because we realized that they're getting older. And all of a sudden you begin to calculate and you realize, man, we've only got this many years. And there's like an anxiety that sets in. You're like, oh, I only got so much time with the kids before they leave home, right? And it was one of those moments. Now, I know because I've been a parent for a while now that those moments come and go, and you know, but in this moment there was just this fear, and it was like, oh man, Elijah turns 16 like next month, February 1st. He turns 16. That's so weird to me because I remember turning 16 like it was yesterday, right? I mean, like that wasn't too long ago, it seems. And then I look and realize, yeah, it was quite a while back, and but just to see him walk, and then to, like Kim said, well, you know, 2 years. He's going to be 18. He's going to be going. I'm like, oh, no. You know, you begin to realize, and all the things you want to teach, right? And all these things you want to instill. And then you look at your youngest, and Luke is 8. And just looking at that, and just like, oh my goodness, you know, you only have so much time with him. And then Bella, you know, and just all of these, you begin to think, who do I want them to become? What habits do they hope that they leave home with? What do I hope that they think of me as a dad when they leave home? It's not going to be shown because I desire it. It's really going to be shown because of my habits, right? You know, has anyone ever told you, well, that was your dad. That was your mom, you know. You know, just a quick marital note, never say that in an argument. But, you know, we've all experienced that, right? Someone has recognized our parents in us, and how did that happen? Did it happen because one day we said, you know what, I want to act more like my dad today, and when this situation arises, I'm going to act as though I were him? No. That never is a conscious thought. Why? It's because it's a habit that we've learned by watching, and now all of a sudden we find ourselves doing because it's become a habit in our life, and it just begin to come out. And the reason why it looks like our mom, or reason why it looks like our dad, is because it's just a habit that's been birthed in us. And I tell you, as a parent, you just begin to get really anxious because you see your kids doing things that you don't like in yourself. And you're like, that's me. That's my stubbornness, or that's my whatever, you know. And you just look at it and you just think, what habits do I want to instill? Who do I want? Not only who do I want to become, but who do I want them to become? How do I want to be as a father? How do I want to be as a husband? How do I want to be as a believer in Jesus Christ? How do I want to be as a pastor? How do I want to be as a friend? Like when friends think about me, what do I hope that comes to their mind? Who do you want to become? Once you've got that down, based on who you want to become, what one habit do you need to start? When I thought about that this week, I thought, there's things that I've been meaning to do, I've been intending to do, and I just haven't done them when it comes to the way I want to lead my kids. There are things I've been needing to do and I've been wanting to do, but when it comes to friendships or when it comes to relationships or when it comes to these things, there's things in my life that I recognize that I'm not doing what I know needs to be done. So what one habit, based on who do you want to become, what one habit do you need to start? Now, if your response is like mine, you're like, well, I got like a list here. I got a whole thing I need to do. And the problem is that's what we always do, and we make this huge list, and then we get overwhelmed, and then we just get paralyzed, and we don't do anything. You ever done that? Right? Have you ever made a to-do list, and you got so exhausted, you're like, I need a nap. There's no, that's us, right? That's what we do. And when we begin to think of the ways in which we need to change, the way in which we need to look more like Christ, it doesn't take very long before we need a nap, because we realize I've got so far to go. At least I do. So what's one thing? What's one thing that you could begin to do today that would help you to become the person that God is calling you to be? You say, I got 10. Oh, that's great. Put those to the side. Let's get one and start there. You see, there's a wheel called the habit loop, and I first heard about this from Craig Rochelle, and I thought it was such a great element, because it talked about this idea that when you're developing a habit, that there has to be a trigger, like something that triggers you, that reminds you of what you've said you're going to do, right? And then as you have that trigger, there has to be an action. There has to be whatever it is that you said you were going to do. So the trigger, that this moment that takes place for Daniel, 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed. So 3 times, the morning, noon, and night. There was these triggers for him. Wake up, pray. Lunch, pray. Afternoon, pray. Right? And there was these triggers for him. The action was that he got down on his knees and prayed. And for many of us, there's a reward, right? When we're developing habits into our life, that there has to be something that comes from that. And so as we begin to look at these ideas of who we are and what God has called us to do, I don't know what God is calling you to do. And I don't know what habits He's calling you to do, to become more like Him. What I believe that He speaks to all of us and shows us that there is a distance from where we are to where He desires us to be. And that as we begin to understand that distance, we see things in our life that need to take place. I was reading statistics this week, and I found that 36% of those who would call themselves believers, they don't pick up the Bible. 36%. Like, they call themselves believers, they don't pick up the Bible. That when we begin to look at those who do read the Bible, man, the statistics are so low of those who read it once a month, those who read it once a week, those who read it daily. And obviously with those times, the percentages begin to drop. We look at the percentages of prayer. Those who take time to daily come before the Lord, to call upon Him, to ask Him to make them more like Himself. I was listening to a sermon on habits a couple of weeks ago, and as I was listening to this, the speaker said, I don't think if you're 10 pounds overweight, God's going to say, nah, get out of here. That's not really like this spiritual issue. I don't think if you drink too much, caffeine, God's going to say, no, that's. But what we find is that all of these little small elements in our life, they really do play into who we are as believers in Jesus Christ. Our health, it really does make a difference in how we live our life. the way in which we talk, it really does make a difference to how other people view us. The way in which we treat our kids, the way in which we treat our spouse, the way in which we handle our anger, the way in which we handle our temptations, the way in which we do these things. When we separate them, it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But when we line them up and we do it daily, every day, day after day after day, it begins to make a big impact, good or bad, in our life and in our testimony, in our relationship with others. And I believe the enemy loves to whisper and say, you know what, it's not that big a deal. It's not really going to make that big a difference. I mean, you really think praying 3 times a day is going to make that big a difference? I mean, really? Are you that naive? Do you really think that opening up your Bible and reading something that you really have never quite understood, you really think it's going to make that big a difference? That's funny. And these lies begin to come into our life. And we find ourselves with well and good intentions. But weeks have passed since we heard what God was calling us to do, and we still haven't done it. What's the trigger for you? And I told you we were going to get real practical today. And as you look at the one thing that God is calling you to do, maybe it is spend more time with Him. Maybe it is that when you wake up, before you have your coffee, coffee's the reward, right? Before you have your coffee, maybe it is that you sit down and you pray and you read. Maybe as God is calling you to draw closer to Him, maybe you just begin to look at your day and say, God, what habit do I need to bring into my life? When I look at who I am around other people, God, I want to be better. What habit could make that take place? What God convicted me of, and I know this is personal. I don't know how else to speak, though. Is that when I looked at just the father, the husband, when I looked at who I desired to be as a believer in Jesus Christ, I just thought, man, you don't write your kids enough notes. I mean, they hear you say you love them, but you know how powerful it is to sit down and you've kept all of these notes that people have written to you? Anyone ever kept those notes, right? How many times have you gone back years later and something someone wrote to you, it spoke to you on that day just as powerfully as it did the day in which you received it? I was convicted by that, and I thought, man, I don't know how many notes my kids have. I don't even know how many notes my wife has. But I just know that they need more. I thought of friends and relationships that I've had over the years and how I tried to be a good friend, but really as I'm really looking at my life as a believer in Jesus Christ, am I drawing other people to Jesus? Am I being a light? Am I being salt in their life? And how can I be more of that? I don't know what that one thing is, but I desire to know, and I just feel like the only way to know is just to ask God, would you show me what that looks like? How I can become more like you in those areas? God, when people look at my kids and they say, boy, that's your dad, is that going to be a positive thing or a negative thing? God, would you show me how to be more like you? See, when I think of those questions, all of a sudden I realize why it was so important for Daniel 3 times a day to get down and pray and ask God, to thank Him for what He's done, but just to spend time in His presence. What is God calling you to do? When you get that out, here's 2 points, and we're going to wrap it up. Make it obvious, right? Make it obvious. If we have a temptation to, and we do this, every year. You're not alone if you do this. Every year we say, I want to get in shape. You know how vague that is, right? What does get in shape mean, right? Someone said, I'm spherical. It's a shape. I was like, well, what does get in shape mean? It's such a vague statement. How do you put hands around that? How do you say this? I did it today. I got in shape today, right? Or if you just say, I want to draw closer to Jesus. That's great. That sounds really good. How are you going to draw closer to Jesus, right? I want to have a better relationship with my kids. I want to have a better relationship with my wife. All wonderful, all powerful. But how do you make it specific? How do you make it obvious where you can go to bed at night and say, I did it or I didn't? How do you make it obvious? I told myself, after I had hurt my neck and I couldn't lift anything. I felt like every time I went to the gym, I was scared I was going to break something. And so I just found myself, wasn't sure what to do. When I would try to jog, it hurt every step. And so I told myself, you know what, you're going to walk to the stop sign and back every day. That's what you're going to do. And so that was my goal, right? And so I began to do that every day to the stop sign and back. It's about a mile. And so I would walk down Park Road and hit the stop sign, turn around and come back. That's what I did. And as I was walking, every day, there were certain days I would get ready to go to bed, or I was getting ready to eat dinner, and I would realize I haven't walked to the stop sign and back, right? Now, had I said I was going to get in shape, I could have said, well, I'm going to eat healthy this meal. It'll all equal out, right? But I had said specifically, I'm going to walk to the stop sign and back. And so it became a judgment for me. Like, had I done it or not? It was very obvious. I understood it. There was no gray areas. Either I had done it or I had not. I believe that when we begin to set these things in our life, the more obvious we can make it, the better it is. Because we're able to follow through. We can't follow through on vague. Right? But we can follow through and say, in the morning I'm going to spend time with God. Or in the evening I'm going to spend time with God. And we know whether we've done it or not. Now here's the truth, and I'll just be honest with you. Every day I haven't made it to the stop sign and back. But on the days that I didn't, I knew exactly what I had done. And the next day I told myself, today you're doing it, right? You messed up, you're getting back up. Today you're doing it. I couldn't have done it if it wasn't obvious. But make it obvious. The second, make it easy. When we say things like, I'm going to spend time with God. Every day I'm going to drive to Red Mountain and I'm going to hike to the top and I'm going to spend time with Jesus. No, that's not easy. You will not do that, right? That's not going to take place every day in your life. But if you'll just say, every day I'm going to read my Bible, and then you put your Bible right where you put the coffee, every day it's much easier, right? But if your Bible is buried in the back room, you haven't seen it for a couple of months, it's going to be much difficult to do those type of things. Make it easy. Right? If I want to write notes to my kids, then every day, then I've said something I want to do, and then I get notes. Right? I need notes if I'm going to write notes and put them out so I see them. Right? I mean, whatever it is that you're calling and what you feel like God is calling you to do, make it obvious and make it easy. And find victory in it. Begin to have a pattern of success in your life. Then Craig Rochelle, he recommends this. He says, I will do blank after I blank. So I will have my coffee after I read my Bible. Right? I will watch the program after I've read the Word. I will spend time doing whatever it is I was going to do after I write the note. I will, whatever it is, after I do what I said I was going to do. You say, well, how big of a difference could that make? Man, that just seems like such a small thing. And I'm reminded of the words in Zechariah chapter 4, verse 10. As we finish with this passage, I want to give you context to the story. Zechariah was a prophet that as the Israelites were coming back to the land in which they had been dispersed from, and as the temple had been completely destroyed, and they were finding themselves, the whole landscape was completely different. Where they had once prospered in their gardens, the gardens had grown up, and this beautiful temple, Solomon's temple, had been destroyed, and all of these type of things. How do we build back these things? How do we get back to where we once were? Who are we going to become? And as they looked at these things, the depression begins to set in, and for 20 years they didn't do anything. And then finally they laid the foundation. But in laying the foundation, it seems like such a small, we've got such a long way to go. And the book of Zechariah picks up 2 months after they've laid the foundation. And here's what he says: "Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin." What a powerful statement. Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. You see, when we begin to take stock of where we are in relationship with Christ, when we begin to say, "God, I desire to be more like you. What's one thing that I could begin to do in my life that would help me to become more like you, or help me to become the person that you're calling me to become?" And as we begin to take these small steps, it can seem very daunting because we think, there's no way I'll ever get to there. Just doing these little things daily, is that really going to take me to there? Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. The Lord rejoices in the fact that you have taken this day to say, "God, who is it that you're calling me to be? And would you show me how to become more like you? And today I'm going to be obedient. Today I'm going to do it. Today, I'm going to stop making excuses. Today, I'm going to stop pretending like it's not going to make a difference. Today, I'm going to realize that just as my bad habits have daily made an impact on my life, I can begin to do the things that God has called me to do, and it will begin to pay dividends in who you've called me to be." Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. Who is God calling you to become? And what is one thing that you could begin to do that could help to see that come to pass? I want you to pray with me. Heavenly Father, Lord, we come before you today asking you to speak to us individually. Because the truth is, we are all at different places coming to the same God who desires for us to be more like Him. So God, wherever we are on that journey, I pray that you would show us what it is that you're calling us to do. God, I pray that if there are those here who don't know you, that today they would realize, just as we heard in the story last week, that the first thing for us to do, to be the person that you've called us to be, is to recognize that we've fallen and that we need a Savior. That we would call upon your name. That we would get up and to accept the salvation that you've come to freely offer. God, maybe some of us, we've known these things, we understand them, but because of life, we've began to get off track. Because of the year in which we just finished, our habits got messed up. God, we began to do things that we used to not do. We began to stop doing things that we used to be so faithful in. And God, I pray that today you would remind us of who you're calling us to be, and that you would show us the thing that you're asking us to do. Lord, help us to make it clear. We don't desire vague instruction, Lord. We desire clarity. And so, Lord, you are not a God of disorder. You are a God of peace. God, I know that you can speak to each and every one of us and show us exactly the one thing that you're calling us to do. Lord, give us the strength to do these things in the name and the power of Jesus Christ. And Lord, as we walk in this way, I pray that it would begin to expand your kingdom in ways that we never thought possible. Lord, as we read the life of Daniel, there's no way of knowing. There is no way that Daniel knew that by doing this daily discipline of 3 times a day, the impact it was going to make, not just on his life, but on the life of an entire foreign kingdom. The wisdom that he would gain, the character that he would gain, the life that he would begin to exhibit as one who believed in the one true God. The ripples that could never truly be counted because of faithful daily action. Lord, help us to establish those habits in our life. And I pray that they would ripple not just in our life, but through our children, our grandchildren, our friends, our co-workers. Lord, that we would not despise small beginnings, but that we would realize that you rejoice that the work has begun. In Jesus' name.